Good afternoon, and welcome back to our Now and Next webinar series, which returns today with a focus on modernization of cybersecurity practices in public and private enterprises through the move towards zero trust network architectures. The fundamental principle of zero trust is to secure an organization's data wherever it may live, while allowing only authenticated and authorized users to access relevant resources and assets. Rooted in the principle of never trust, always verify, zero trust is designed to protect modern digital environments by leveraging network segmentation, preventing lateral movement, providing layered threat prevention, and simplifying user access controls. To break this down even further, a successful zero trust program must implement a system of continuous monitoring, accept that external and internal threats are always on the network, know that the physical location of a network device is not enough to conclude its trustworthiness, authenticate and authorize every device, every user, and every workflow, and implement policies that are dynamic and draw on as many data sources as possible. Zero trust cybersecurity principles and initiatives have become achievable only because of advances in the maturation in interoperable technologies. Today, it's possible to continually analyze and evaluate access requests in a dynamic and granular fashion. Policy administrators can deal with need to access requests in real time. They can take actions to mitigate data exposure due to compromised accounts, attackers monitoring a network, and deal with other threats. First introduced in 2010 by Forrester Research, the term zero trust describes the movement away from implied trust based on network location and instead focuses on evaluating trust on a per transaction basis. In other words, no longer should trust be granted behind the firewall. Rather, trust is granted on a per session basis, regardless of where a user is located and regardless of what device he or she is using. Zero trust isn't a new concept for the US government, but still there's been much interest in the topic since President Biden's May 2021 executive order charged agencies with advancing their zero trust adoption. Progress towards zero trust will happen incrementally with process changes and technology modernization, but it's moving. Zero trust architecture can protect against common threats and improve an organization's security posture when combined with existing cybersecurity policies and guidance, enhanced identity and access management tools, and continuously monitoring users, devices, applications, networks, and data. There have been two significant forcing functions that accelerated the embrace of zero trust as a desired model for cybersecurity. First, high-profile breaches have bypassed traditional perimeter-based defenses and enabled attackers to escalate privileges and move laterally undetected through victims' environments. And second, the COVID pandemic, an unplanned and extended shift to remote working, has strained the limits of legacy information technology systems. The attack surface significantly expanded, often via non-enterprise-owned devices, which caused perimeter defenses to be challenged even further. Accordingly, we are seeing the move to embrace zero trust architectures become a global imperative. Our experts today will explore why this is the case. They'll share their insights into the evolution and maturation of zero trust, and we'll conclude with a discussion on the technological advancements that reduce the complexity of moving to a zero trust environment. During the program, you'll see select polling questions. Please take a minute to answer them as they pop up. We also encourage you to ask questions of our speakers by using the chat box on the right of your screen. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our Cyber Leadership Council members, BlackBerry, IBM, and Splunk for helping us bring you this program today. Leading the discussion is my colleague, Vince Voci, Vice President for Cyber Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Vince, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris, for teeing up this afternoon's discussion, and I want to welcome our panelists who are here today to share their advice and expertise with each of you. Jason Keenan is a zero trust strategy leader with IBM Security. Ryan Permy is a senior vice president and chief security architect with BlackBerry, and Bill Wright is our senior director of North America Government Affairs with Splunk. Thank you all for being here today. Bill, I want to start today's conversation with a few questions for you first and foremost. First, how has zero trust gone from a buzzword to becoming a major security organizing theme for the federal government? How did we get here?
Yeah, thank you, Vince, and thanks for having me here. Prior to Splunk, I was with the Senate Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee for a number of years, where we had just started talking about cybersecurity as a matter of policy, and now here we are. So a lot of my viewpoints are kind of rooted in the policy perspective rather than the purely technical. And thank you, Vince, Chris, and the Chamber for pulling this discussion together. I honestly can't think of another organization or an organization that would be better suited to pull together these wide swath of public and private entities. So thank you for your question. So, it wasn't long ago, as you say, where zero trust truly was a buzzword. I think I viewed it as a buzzword, certainly. I think it's important to understand how we got here. As Chris just said in his opening, zero trust is not a new concept. It's been around for a decade or more. The term was coined all the way in 2010. So why now? Well, I think the truth is that the status quo has failed sometimes. In the past, we governed information security by this perimeter-based network security model, and some would argue that this approach worked pretty well for a while, especially when your perimeter was in fact clearly defined on your network. This model assumed that any user inside the boundary of the corporate network, once it got through our high walls, it was deemed trusted. And conversely, any user outside of the perimeter was not trusted. This idea of trust functioned as the primary justification for deciding which applications or resources people could access. However, as we all know, as time went on, perimeter security became less effective because of a number of factors, including the growth of cloud computing, increased use of mobile technology, and just changes to the way people worked. So this paradigm shift was already happening to a zero trust environment, but it took a global pandemic and a few pretty devastating high profile breaches to really cement zero trust as our governing cybersecurity principle. The pandemic, of course, dispersed our workforce, changed how and where people access their corporate networks. This move really blurred or degraded the contours of that perimeter and enlarged the attack surface. And of course, the high-level breach that I'm referring to is SolarWinds. This is when a broad swath of U.S. government agency and corporations were compromised in what I think many would consider one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks in history. The exploit, known as Sunburst, was exposed in December 2020 when cybersecurity experts realized that the IT management software SolarWinds had been hacked. I won't belabor the details, but for the purposes of today's conversation, it's important to ask, could zero trust alone have prevented the attack? Probably not. But I'm in the camp that thinks zero trust could have mitigated the impact by potentially calling attention to it sooner and by limiting its spread. The way I look at it, the basic precepts of zero trust is a bit of a twist on Reagan's trust but verify. So never trust, always verify. In practice, that comes down to three main tenets. Secure access. So this is nothing and no one gets access to the network unless it's authenticated, authorized, and verified at each moment. Least privilege. Granting least privilege access based on who is requesting the access, the context of the request, and then log everything. So all traffic must be logged, inspected at various inspection points that identity and permit traffic based on established rules. This maintains that least privilege access. And Chris just mentioned the cybersecurity executive order. It was issued in May, really codified many of these zero trust main tenets. Every agency, of course, is required to develop their zero trust plans and submit those for review by OMB and NIST. NIST has jumped in to try to help and developed a maturity model that agencies can use to benchmark and help move them along this continuum. In addition, there was an entire section of the EO devoted to logging and logging standardization. The drafters, I think, really understood the importance of security logs. So 2 years ago, we were working our way towards ZT, but it really took this pandemic and high-profile attacks to accelerate its implementation.
Bill, that's a great opening segue there. And I think we might have to come back to the most provocative question that you asked. Could SolarWinds have been prevented? And ask for Ryan and Jason's thoughts on that towards the end of the program. But look, picking up on a couple of the things that you talked about, and especially with technology innovation coming out of the private sector, how can industry best partner with government agencies to reach their ZTA goals? You talked about some of the work that NIST and OMB is doing, and where OMB has tasked the federal civilian agencies, but DoD has been working on this for some time too. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing from the government agencies and leveraging private sector innovation?
Sure. As you say, DoD was early on this bandwagon and absolutely critical to moving the concept along. As far as the private sector goes, this is where the innovative companies on this call and others that the chamber represents come into play. Cybersecurity truly is a team sport. No company can go it alone. Certainly, no government can go it alone. And as we've already mentioned a few times, Zero Trust is not a solution or a product unto itself, but an evolving set of cybersecurity paradigms that move network defenses from static, network-based perimeter to focus on the users, the assets, the resources. And you cannot identify or combat a threat or an issue if you cannot see it. That is why I think visibility is key to ensuring informed decisions and ensuring the right security posture. So when you think of Zero Trust, at least when I think of it, I think of data as the foundation, and all data is security relevant. So a place that can help is to make sense of that data. Data integration, security analytics platform that ingests that data from any source, regardless of its format, regardless of its type, structure, even its scale. So in the case of Splunk, we can provide that granular visibility to help assess a connecting entity's current profile, and then continuously monitor events and metrics across the organization for fast and informed decision making. There's been a tremendous amount of progress in both government and among private sector around AI and ML to help sift through those volumes of data, bring out those relevant aspects across hybrid infrastructures into one view. Another area of innovation is around orchestration and automation capabilities to automate those repetitive tasks and workflows across your SIM and other security tools while allowing the end user oversight and interaction. And this is becoming an increasingly important aspect, especially with the dearth of cybersecurity professionals out there right now. And this problem, in fact, is even more acute within the public sector, where they're competing for cybersecurity professionals. So there's a lot of innovative tools out there to help with with many elements of Zero Trust, tools that weren't available just a few years ago. And a lot of this innovation is coming out of the private sector.
And Bill, you just touched on one thing that I think that I'm interested to pull the thread on a little bit, and that's the resources required to implement Zero Trust cybersecurity principles. You talked about the human capital. What obstacles do you foresee for agencies to implement Zero Trust in their environments?
Yeah, so Zero Trust clearly is the governing security strategy that the administration wants and is taking. The strategy is codified, as we mentioned, in the cybersecurity EO and resulting guidance that's come out from OMB and NIST. So resources is going to be an issue. There's a number of what I would consider unfunded mandates in the executive order. Government agencies have traditionally been under-resourced, to put it lightly. And the 2-year budgetary planning cycle that they deal with can sometimes be cumbersome. Especially in relation to how quickly these cyber threats are evolving. There are a few pieces of good news, however. First, I think agencies can access $1 billion of technology modernization funds that exist out there, and they're specifically designed for these types of technology transformation, such as zero trust. Another good piece of news is that organizations don't necessarily need to toss out their existing technology to move to this zero trust architecture. The vast majority of the tools that organizations are using and already own can be refocused, reconfigured to support zero trust architecture. So while there may be investments needed, in fact, there will be investments needed, those investments can really be targeted on the gaps around your architecture.
Bill, I'm glad you mentioned the $1 billion that was appropriated through the ARP earlier this year for the Technology Modernization Fund. But I think we understand there's about 110 different projects that OMB is reviewing and is looking forward to making some approvals on later this year. But you're spot on taking out where we are in the budget cycle and what's happening this week in Congress. Maybe we'll come back next week with a different answer. Brian, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and ask for your thoughts on how organizations should be thinking about their zero trust journey.
So zero trust, as Ben mentioned before, it's not a terribly new concept. It's a strong refinement, considering that a lot of the operating models that we have are really 50 years old in cyber, but 1,000, 2,000 years old in reality. You put your stuff in a safe, keep it safe. The reality is that as we continue to evolve, we become much more distributed. We take our value with us, we connect and interact all around the world, and we need a new operating model to do this. We continue to think about these things in terms of users and devices, applications, data, and networks that we interact with. And while the concept is zero trust, and you shouldn't inherently trust anything, building explicit trust is really the nature of zero trust. And to do it, this is really fundamentally a data problem. I started my career on the offensive side, but I've been building defensive solutions for about 20 years now. Fundamentally, if you would have asked me 10 years ago if math and data were going to be the solution to our problems, I probably would have laughed at you. However, the reality is that every single tool that we have in our network, security and otherwise, generates a constant stream of data exhaust. Now, most of that we throw away. By reimagining how we operate on this, I like to use a model called OODA, which is observe, orient, detect, and act, to begin to describe how we can use this data. Effectively, everything, whether we're talking about our antivirus, our firewalls, our IAM, can become effectively a sensor for us to understand. And the more sensor data that we have, the more we can look at users as constellations of interactions, the more appropriate we can get in terms of defining policy and defining normality. And that's really a big push in zero trust, is we want to start to define how people can operate, regardless of where they are, in an ongoing way. And to do that, really, it's going to be driven significantly by AI and ML, because we don't have humans that can watch over shoulders. And from a privacy perspective, we don't want humans to be watching over shoulders. Well-trained AI and ML helps us not just come to the right decision, but it also helps us punch above our weight class in terms of having operators available to do this. Early stage models, as you go through that observe, you collect the data, orient, you analyze that data, you make a decision, and you act, and you feed that forward. Early models tend to be decision support. They help humans make good decisions, but as those models evolve and become more effective, you not only get a degree of autonomy or agency of them, but you also get fantastic streams of data in the logs that Bill talked about, meaning that you can have explainability in why decisions are being made.
Thanks, Ryan. You hit on a couple of the data-driven points that I want to come back to in a few minutes. But first, bringing Jason into the discussion, can you talk a little bit about IBM's Zero Trust evolution and give us some examples of how IBM, or maybe one of your customer-focused initiatives, is paving the way on the Zero Trust future?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Vince. So I think that the points that Ryan and Bill made, even Chris in the opening, lays out some of the key principles and the driving forces behind Zero Trust and why it's important, and even how some of the evolutions in technology innovation are facilitating Zero Trust actually becoming a reality now, rather than just theory, as it was, 10 plus years ago. But I know when I'm talking to clients, there's still it can still be overwhelming, right? Where do I start? How do I progress? Applying AI, ML, getting telemetry from everywhere and monitoring, can sound like a daunting task for sure. So I know the recommendations that we're giving is really to focus on use cases. So understanding what the organizational priorities are, what are some of the key business initiatives that you're focusing on, and looking how you can adopt Zero Trust principles to achieving those outcomes, because Zero Trust is a journey. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not as simple as putting in a single product. So you really do need to work across those different pillars, right? That Ryan was just mentioning: the identity, data, network, endpoints, application security. So if you can take like a horizontal use case, you can start to apply those principles in a much more consumable fashion and be able to show measurable results as a part of it. So, if I start with IBM, not IBM as a vendor or as a solution provider, but IBM as a corporation, we've been on a Zero Trust journey for maybe 5 to 7 years or so. And maybe when we started, we weren't actually even calling it Zero Trust at the time. But the real foundation for what was driving us in that direction was the fact that we were becoming a cloud-first company, not just as far as being a cloud service provider, but how we run our business, how we run our operations, the services that we integrate with partners, how we, for our workforce and employees, everything is becoming cloud first. That means consuming SaaS applications. That means, new homegrown apps that we are developing and running ourselves. Those are now moving out into public cloud. Not that the data center is going away, so it's now kind of this hybrid cloud environment, which adds to the complexity. But this has forced us to rethink how we're doing security, and it put a specific emphasis for us on identities and endpoints. Because once you kind of take the network controls out of the equation, you lose some of that telemetry, those data sources that Ryan was talking about, and that Bill was talking about as well. So you need to find new control points and new sources of those telemetries. And so for us, that was focusing on identity and endpoint. So on the identity side, it actually started with IBM taking our internal identity provider or identity source and moving that to the cloud. So we took advantage of an IDaaS, or an identity as a service, and externalizing those identities. So now they could be used in a federated model as a control point for, accessing cloud applications. Now, of course, we layered in foundational technologies like single sign-on, use more multi-factor authentication, but also took in additional context as we're making those access decisions in a true Zero Trust way, looking at the endpoint, looking at, is this a known device? Is this a new device? Is the device corrupted or compromised in some fashion? Is it infected with malware or exhibiting some other kinds of behavior? And by doing such, we're starting to apply those principles of continuous verification, or never trust, always verify. So that has been the driver for IBM as a corporation. We've been helping a number of other clients as well. One other one that I'll mention is a global chemical manufacturer who was looking at supporting their growing remote workforce, specifically being driven by the pandemic, like a lot of your organizations as well. And what they were doing and centering around is, how do I establish secure connections to my environment, to my manufacturing environments, to my my enterprise applications for this growing remote workforce, when I can't rely on my traditional network security. And so they were looking at modernizing their network security controls and integrating that with identity. So again, it became a point about integrating context from across these different environments to be able to deliver on those key principles of zero trust, like enabling least privilege and doing that continuous verification. So those are just a couple of examples that we've seen as of organizations, adopting zero trust in kind of a phased manner, but again, focused on specific use cases and outcomes.
That's a super awesome lead in, Jason. Ryan, what are some of these myths around zero trust modernization?
First, it's going to be hard and challenging for everybody. By not trusting, we're going to have to continue to re-show who we are, to re-show every time, especially as we start shifting from these long-running, I'm sitting behind a firewall in my desk, I must be me, to a transactional nature. That does require a lot more decision-making, but the systems are designed to be much more effective at that decision-making, making it much more a zero-touch than just a zero trust. Adding to what Jason's talking about with continuous, really both continuous authentication, keeping a real-time risk model of what's happening in that constellation of users, devices, applications, and data, keeps it such that as long as you're operating within the areas that you should be, there's very little friction, and friction only becomes introduced when it becomes absolutely necessary, when there's gaps in understanding of the identity. So this is hard is going to be the first myth. The second myth is that the old way was better, and this is one that I want people to really think about. It was certainly more familiar, and in those days where there were very few devices and very thick boundaries between the inside and outside networks, perhaps it may have had a small amount, but there were still compromises, even in those mostly closed networks. As we've shifted, compute has become commoditized. We've heard about the cloud, elements shifting towards cloud. So many companies and agencies are using SaaS services like Office 365 or Salesforce, such that wherever they are, they have access to data. But this has also shifted data sitting at an edge on an endpoint away. A lot of this data is effectively highly distributed. And so this idea that there was ever a way that we could centralize and castle our defenses falls apart in the idea that we have this infinitely distributed way that we end up working. And it's happening in bleeding edge small companies, all the way up to massive corporations and governments are beginning to shift their workloads to cloud. They're beginning to shift access to SaaS type of applications because fundamentally it's become an easier way. The individual application is sort of blended away for the mesh of applications and data that you have in the cloud.
Jason, almost related question. My castle is impervious. Why should I move to zero trust?
Congratulations. I think you're the only one. In reality, I mean, zero trust is not going to be 100% guarantee that you will never have a breach, or it's not never a guarantee of 100% protection. But what it is it's about risk management, right? It's about understanding, where your critical assets and resources are, and making sure that you've got the most secure access controls in place to be able to protect those. But in the end, as I said, it's not 100% guarantee, and so you have to have kind of that, what I refer to as the safety net on the back end, to be able to respond in the event. And what that does is that kind of reduces the blast radius should an incident actually occur in your environment. And building on something that Bill said earlier around the need for orchestration and automation, I completely agree with that. Like, in order to reduce the amount of time to respond to an incident, you can't rely on just human capital to be able to go and respond to those things. You need to take advantage of the tools that we have in place now that allow API level integrations across all of the different control points. So even though you may think you're impervious, I think all of the headlines that we've seen of late, unfortunately, would prove that nobody is immune to a cyber incident. So, starting to follow this zero trust methodology is about, reducing the risk that you have inside your organization.
So I think what I've heard from both you and Ryan is zero trust architectures and environments do not have levels of friction that maybe an outside or non-user may perceive there to be. The old way, the old castle and perimeter and wall is no longer impervious, especially to supply chain attacks. And once insiders are inside of an environment, that the latency is not necessarily true, although maybe may still have a little bit of truth to that, that skills and resources are meeting. Ryan, could you talk a little bit about maybe some concerns with either interoperable technologies or offboarding legacy assets and how that plays into this journey? Because it's not like it's not like most organizations are going to go out and build a green new architecture. So
in certain circumstances, you'll see some of that, like net new IT projects coming up on a zero trust plane. Legacy takes a while. Oftentimes, it involves leveraging types of technologies, as Jason said, API and orchestration, using the controls that you have, being driven by much more of a zero trust controller rather than having pure zero trust elements there. In a lot of cases, what we're going to continue to see is application of concepts like gateways in front of increasingly legacy applications until they can be ripped, renewed, and put into sort of the new way. You'll have tighter force controls, web application gateways being a primary one. As we continue to walk down the path, though, we're finding more and more ability to do almost the converse. Concepts like web application gateways can actually not just protect those legacy applications, they can enable them such that you don't need to be on the inside of the network to access them anymore. If we're going on the premise that it doesn't matter where your data is, and it doesn't matter where you are, you should be able to establish a zero trust, it becomes less scary to hide your data deep in a data center. And so you can use concepts like web application gateways to bridge that, assuming that those gateways apply a degree of control. But earlier, and I think it was Bill that said, what we'll probably expect people to see is engagement in natural SaaS applications, as sort of a first path for many.
Thanks, Ryan. Jason, I wanted to ask you to expand on something that we've been thinking a lot about here at the Chamber. Part of the genesis for this series is about educating businesses, about educating government leaders on these not new, but certainly new concepts, certainly much more talked about, and what they need to know next. So as you're talking to clients and potential employers for some of IBM Security's offerings, how do you show them that the business imperative to zero trust?
Yeah, I think it goes along the lines of what I was talking about earlier around the concept of use cases. And, I think too much the cybersecurity teams inside of either private or public organizations are a couple of things. They're either thought of as, the Department of No, or they're, just kind of kept on the outside of what the actual business operations are of the organization. What we're seeing, though, is that because of kind of the high profile incidents that are occurring, it's putting an extra emphasis on the need for cybersecurity. And then things like President Biden's executive order is yet another indication of the overall importance of putting the focus there on cybersecurity. So as we're kind of talking to clients around this, we're advocating again to take kind of that use case approach. And we're focusing on, in our conversations, on 4 key business initiatives to which zero trust can be applied. And it's not saying that these are the only 4 business initiatives in the world that matter for zero trust, but they resonate, I think, with a lot of different organizations. So they start with protecting the hybrid cloud, securing the hybrid workforce, reducing the risk of business disruption and ransomware in particular, and also preserving customer privacy. So across each one of those different business initiatives, there are multiple challenges that kind of come into play when you think of some of the individual security concerns. And so just looking for a point solution or doing kind of, security business as usual to help those real transformational types of journeys, we know just isn't going to work. And so that's why we start advising and looking at a zero trust architecture or a zero trust approach to start solving those problems.
Thanks, Jason. And to our audience, our speakers are going to take a few questions from you in just a minute, but I want to ask our team to post the first poll question and ask for your participation. So on your screen, we want to know, does your company currently have a plan to migrate to a zero trust cybersecurity model? Yes, no, in progress. So love the feedback on that. Bill, the first audience question is going to come over to you. Which government agencies are leading the definition and standards for zero trust in either hardware or software? So I know you touched on that in some of your opening thoughts. So if you can take that, great.
Yeah, there's a lot of leadership in the government. I think, as we mentioned earlier, DoD has played a huge outsized role early on. DoD has been talking about zero trust for at least a couple of years now, and some of the white papers they put out around it, some of the seminal documents. Fast forward a little bit, and the main players here, you have OMB and CISA. Both have recently put out guidance documents for zero trust to the agencies, and then lastly, NIST recently put out an early draft, I suppose, of an initial guidance to help agencies kind of benchmark where they are in the continuum of zero trust. So there's also a number of smaller agencies that have been working this issue for quite a while, and are really going to rely kind of on the guidance that's coming out now. Thank you.
That's great, Bill. And just to add to what you had said there, I think CISA is looking for comments on their zero trust maturity model by October 1st. And if you go to zerotrust.cyber.gov, you can actually pull down that maturity model and offer, and they've got the comment submission forms there. Ryan, wanted to throw this next one over to you from our audience. How does one identify the essential pieces of zero trust?
Sure. Generally, I tend to slice this along users, devices, applications, data, and networks. And so as you're looking around, you need to have visibility points into each of these. A really common way to get this is through endpoint devices. EDR is an example of this. It instruments, whether a laptop or even a mobile device, and gives you a stream of data. From a user perspective, technologies like IAM give you a very strong ability to understand what's happening. Network could be anything from network application gateways or web application gateways. Firewalls still matter. The concept here is not that we throw out our firewalls and even VPNs. It's just that we use them more effectively and more transactionally versus locationally. And as you continue to go through this, the last piece that you have to remember is that at the center of all of this needs to be a brain. And this could be your SIEM, it could be a data platform, it could be a data lake. Bringing this data together and using it to make real-time models and decisions is going to be where a lot of vendors, including BlackBerry, are going to be focusing a significant amount of their future development. But you don't have to wait. A well-run SOC can operate very similar to a brain of a zero trust model. Leveraging concepts like orchestration can help. Leveraging concepts like integration with your controls can help. It may not be zero latency, but having that visibility and understanding can start to get you where you need to be going without necessarily waiting for a full overhaul.
Thanks, Ryan. And just to put a fine point on it, so that was identity, user, data, applications, and networks, 5 pillars, both outlined in NIST's 800-207 special pub, and some of the OMB and CISA guidance as well. Bill, I think you wanted to tag in here on some of the user behavior analytics as well and offer a thought.
Sure, just picking up on what Ryan mentioned earlier. He used the term digital exhaust. I like that term. So one of the bonus features of Zero Trust is that organizations will begin to generate more data, more machine data. Each time there is a movement, you're producing another piece of machine data. This digital exhaust can provide tremendous insights across your organizations, not necessarily just in the security realm either. But chief among them is data user behavior, on user behavior. Once you develop a baseline of what normal behavior is and looks like in your organization, you can then begin to identify if that behavior deviates from the norm. User and entity behavior analytics, UBA, solution can provide advanced and insider threat detection using unsupervised machine learning. So this will help your organization find those unknown threats and anomalous behavior across devices, users, and applications. It can also automatically stitch together multiple anomalies going across multiple entities. So think users, accounts, devices, and applications into one single threat, really simplifying things for your analysts and allowing them to accelerate their actions.
Thanks, Bill. And just to loop back with the poll results, about 50% said yes, they are moving towards a zero trust environment. 13% or 12% said no. 33% are in progress. So vast majority of our audience moving towards ZTA, which is an interesting data point for our audience. Ryan, I want to come back to you. You mentioned you've been both in the security industry and a technologist for well over 20 years, interacting with businesses and governments on both sides of the red team, blue team equation. Can you talk about some of the advances in interoperable access control technologies that are allowing enterprise security teams to holistically monitor the overall security in their organization?
Particularly around access control has come such a long way. It used to be that you had to spend weeks trying to get client A and service B to work together. Standards work, whether we're talking about IETF, who writes sort of the internet standards, all the way through IEEE. We're finding more and more both global standards organizations as well as governmental standards organizations and groups like MITRE who are bringing together the ability for different vendors to talk to one another. Now, there's been a significant shift towards compatibility with concepts like web applications and web APIs as a pretty standard way of talking across the internet. As more of our elements have shifted towards cloud-driven, SaaS-driven, web API-driven, the differentiation in understanding one versus the other comes significantly down. And so that also means that the tooling for understanding and managing these goes up significantly. Certainly it helps with some of the shift towards cloud, because there are a plethora of fantastic visibility and management tools, not just for security, but across the concept. And we're starting to find repetitive patterns in concepts like DevOps and DevSecOps that begin to help us manage those processes even better. So I think interoperability will always be there. But the concept of data transmission has gotten better than it's been in 20 years.
Thanks, Ryan. Jason, turning over to you. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about how zero trust isn't necessarily a single piece of technology and a single product, but rather either a set of cybersecurity principles, or as I think IBM likes to talk about it, an IT strategy that is done securely. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking here?
Yeah, sure. So, building on, again, some of the comments that Bill and Ryan have made as well. So, I mean, we've talked about some of the starting points potentially, or pillars of security domains with, identity, endpoint, network, applications, and data. Now, I think that the challenge is if we continue to look at those individual security domains in isolation, it's going to be prohibitive of getting us to a zero trust architecture. So we've talked about the need for interoperability, as Ryan was just saying. And so what we like to focus on is the specific security outcomes. Now, those individual pillars are not going to go away for good reasons, but there's a need to be able to more tightly unify those things. And we focus on the outcomes, and we look at them as insights, enforcement, and detection and response. So insights is about understanding what you have in your environment. You need to know what to protect, right? Where are your critical resources? Who are your users? What devices are they connecting in from? And how do you apply analytics across all of that to understand where your risks are, and where do you prioritize and apply those principles of least privilege? And then on the enforcement side, this is kind of the heart of zero trust. Like when you look at the NIST component architecture for a zero trust architecture, right in the center is this concept of a policy decision point and policy enforcement point. And so being able to take in context from across the environment about your users, about the resources and assets, about the environment that they're connecting in from, about behavioral traits, whether that's coming from UBA or, other behavioral patterns and things like behavioral biometrics, to be able to do a risk or a trust score and understand, should I allow this entity, this user, to have access to this resource at this point in time, not based on static policies, but based on rich context and information. And then the third and final is around that detection and response. So with zero trust, we want to put as much in focus on the protection side as possible, because you don't want to let the bad things happen, but sometimes they do. And that's about assuming breach. And so that's about collecting the telemetry, that context from across all of those pillars, across your IT environment, and being able to apply analytics to find the potential threat, and then use the orchestration and automation to stop it and adjust your policies in real time as well. So you end up with this system that connects across all of those different pillars, sharing context, and allowing it to be optimized and improved over time as well.
And Jason, I just want to stick with you for another couple of minutes, because you touched on the principles of least privilege, and I wondered if you could expand on how policy administrators should be enforcing principles of least privilege throughout their environment.
So, I mean, this is not a new problem. I mean, when we talk about like the concepts of identity governance and identity management, to understanding and making sure that users, and I'm using that term loosely because it could be entities, it could be non-human users as things as well, but to make sure that users have only enough access to get their job done or on an as needed basis. And so much in the past has been around relying on actual human processes to do those approvals. So, me as a manager gets certification or access requests, should my employee Bob be able to have access to this critical application? And a lot of times, unfortunately, the approvers don't put a lot of time, thought, or effort into it. And they click yes, what we give like the rubber stamp kind of approval on things. Not because they're being malicious, or maybe even not because they're being lazy, but because they don't understand. They don't know necessarily what it is that they're approving. And so what has advanced now is when we talk about having more data available, about having AI and machine learning available, is being able to apply that to that decision-making process as well, to help. And not to take the responsibility away from a human, but to help aid them in the decision making on whether or not users should have access. And then, being able to identify when there are potentially dormant accounts, which are a big risk, or when there are orphaned accounts, or when users have multiple kind of conflicting entitlements or permissions. And being able to use that to help advise that, no, Bob should not have access to this for, whatever reasons. And that helps, again, restrict your overall, the risk landscape that you have, and helps advance that principle of least privilege.
Thanks, Jason. That was a great oversight of least privilege. We got one last round of audience Q&A and one final poll that's going to be on the right side of your screen. So what kinds of cyber defense tactics does your company have in place already? Go ahead and select a choice. So strong identity management, including multi-factor authentication, encryption for data at rest, application testing, perimeter and firewall security, asset inventory, CDM programs, EDR tools, threat intel, automated incident response, cloud infrastructure. So a bunch of choices there. Maybe just a final round of question, and maybe Ryan, I'll start with you for your closing thoughts on what in particular the next iteration of Zero Trust will be, and then Jason will go to you, and then Bill will finish up with you.
Sure. This is an interesting one because it's not a flash in the pan. This is how we are going to be handling security going forward. We're already seeing this in areas around industrial control, automotive, and even in consumer applications. This concept will be spreading further and further above and beyond, outside of just enterprises, organizations, and governments. This is how we're going to continue to do business, and the tools will continue to get better and better. The skills that folks have will become better and better. It's a process, a journey, not a destination.
Thanks, Ryan. And Jason, next over to you. What's next for ZTA? And also maybe layer in a few thoughts on this audience question. What initiatives, prototypes, methods, applications, either national or international, have demonstrated promise? And you talked yesterday a little bit about the NIST NCCOE project that I think IBM and maybe a few others are a part of. But what's next from your perspective?
Yeah, that question is timely, because that was going to be a part of my response on what's next. So, we talked about interoperability being a key part of zero trust architectures, and we're not at end game for that by any stretch. There's definitely been advances, but NIST through the NCCOE is sponsoring a work group around zero trust architecture implementations, and it's a multi-vendor initiative. There's actually 19 vendors that are participating. And the reason for that is because, as we've all said, zero trust is not going to be achieved with a single vendor or a single technology. So organizations have heterogeneous environments, and they need to make them work together. And so a part of that work group initiative is to show specific scenarios implemented with a zero trust architecture using multi-vendor technologies to achieve those. And so I think what's going to come out of that as well is further identification for standards that are needed. So whether those are communication standards, data and context sharing standards around specific schemas for context sharing. I think we'll start to flesh out more of those and have more open community sorts of interactions, all towards driving towards this concept, I think, of a zero trust platform, or more of like a mesh sort of solution that allows these different components to interoperate together towards those common goals and outcomes of zero trust.
Yeah, thank you, Vince. I'll jump in here real quick. I know we're running short here. I agree. Zero trust is really a journey, not necessarily a destination. And it's also important to point out that it's a change in culture. It's a change in how we're viewing these threats. That said, bad guys are innovating quickly as well. So using that data exhaust that Ryan talked about, and drawing insights from that data is where I think we're really going to see a lot of the movement. User behavior analytics, enabling orchestration and automation. The advancements are going to be made from getting the most insight out of your data, acting on that information, and then doing it all in real time and in an automated fashion. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That's a great, and thank you to all the panelists, Brian, Jason, and Bill for today's episode and participating in today's Now Next program. It's really all the time we had to do today. The hour flew by. There's lots more that we could unpack on this issue. I in particular want to thank our Cyber Leadership Council members, BlackBerry, IBM, and Splunk for helping to make today's program possible. Please join us for our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, October 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And that program will focus on ways in which businesses can migrate securely to cloud service environments, something that I know a lot of our audience members at least noted in the last poll that they are using in some way, shape, or form. For those that missed it and are interested, CISA does have an open consultation on their zero trust maturity model. Log on to zerotrust.cyber.gov for more information there. In the meantime, check out uschamber.com for additional resources. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of the Now Next series on moving to zero trust architectures, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.